Welcome back to Expert Connect, sponsored by Capgemini Government Solutions on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Fornicola, and I'm joined by Denise Tauriello, a principal with Capgemini Government Solutions. Denise, great to have you here today.
Thank you, Jason. Pleasure to be here.
Talk to me about what Capgemini can offer the federal government at this time of citizen demand for an efficient and accessible government.
Yes, so I think I'd start with, Jason, is the health and benefits sector in particular is just completely overwhelmed with case management type challenges. And we really look at that from a digital transformation standpoint in terms of what we believe we have to offer the federal government. And looking at that, I think probably the best way for me to share what I think we have to offer in a way that makes the most sense is to share an example. So one of the things that Capgemini has done for the global public sector is some of these large-scale digital transformation, moving paper-driven, slow, mundane case management processes to a much more large-scale digital transformation. So an example would be, you look at all of the claims that are happening right now in our space, Social Security, CMS Medicare, the VA claims, and you hear it on the radio, on your radio station frequently, how difficult those things are. The Social Security Administration alone on any given day is somewhere around 1 million claims, disability claims behind. So to bring that full circle around an example of what Capgemini has done for other organizations in the public sector is the government of Norway is a great example. So the government of Norway decided they would do an IT modernization for their welfare pension system. It was a $500 million effort over several years, and Capgemini was involved from the very beginning around the IT components and the strategy in particular. And one of the things that I think is important is that we took a look at stakeholders and the way of doing business. So it wasn't just, let's look at what kind of technology platform you have. Let's see what kind of computers are in the back room. How are you doing business? How should you be doing business in the future? And the piece that was missing for them was really around two things: processing time and user experience. Okay, so it was taking months, almost even potentially a year, to process the claims that were coming in. And the user experience just was non-existent. It was on the phone for hours. There was not a digital way to interact with the organization. And Norway knew that they had a growth potential of pensioners that was going to be up around 40% within the next couple of years. So they made a decision. We're going to move from our legacy systems. We're going to modernize. We are going to go to a digital transformation model. So they engaged Capgemini to participate in that process. And what Capgemini did that was really interesting, after looking at the stakeholders and the process flow and how they do business, was think about the user experience. Think about that as you integrate it into the flow in terms of how the case management system was going to be set up. And they moved the system from, they created a self-service solution on a service-oriented architecture with an open source framework, which is very flexible, very, very, very easy to expand and grow against, right? So they determined what the needs were and they addressed those. And then combined with that, they built in a self-service functionality that was scenario-based. So citizens on their own could access from their homes, from their cell phones, an application to run the scenarios around their retirement, making decisions, right? Looking at the data that was available to them. Is it a benefit to me to retire early? Should I retire this year? What benefit do I gain if I wait additional 5 years? And what does that look like for me? And what's the cost-benefit analysis in terms of getting there? And I think that's a great example of what the types of things I know Social Security is thinking about, I know VA is thinking about, I know CMS is thinking about. And we believe that we can bring some of that expertise into the U.S. federal market.
Denise, what was the end result of that Norway example?
So great question. Obviously the results are what matter. So right now there's two things that from an outcome standpoint. One, every single pensioner that's on the books is using that system. They're connected, and processing times moved from months to less than a minute for individual claims to be reviewed and determinations to be made.
So you've hit those two key points, processing time and user experience. It really sounds like what you've been able to do is give the people of Norway the opportunity to interact with their government in their homes.
There you go, exactly. Which was what we are all demanding now, right? So, so I think that in the federal space, and I think that the federal leaders have realized this, but they're not quite sure how to get there. And I know they want to get there. But one of the things that I'll share is cell phones, right? I don't have a prop to hold, but we know that the younger generation in particular, not that I'm old, but the younger generation in particular, if they can't access it from their phone, right? If they can't get their boarding pass on their phone, they can't look up their financial information on their phone. If it's not here, then number one, it doesn't exist, and number two, you're not meeting them where they need you to be.
What are some barriers, if any, on this example that you shared about Norway translating to the U.S. federal government? Obviously, the size is a factor, but talk to me about some of those concerns.
So I think the obvious place to go is size, but from my perspective, frankly, I think the larger issues are really around leadership and commitment. And I'll tell you why. So Capgemini did numerous studies, and there's a book, Leading Digital, and there's ways to take a look at this, but the example really is that the digital model doesn't work. So organizations cannot transform and move to where they want to be without leadership and commitment. And that means the very top of the organization must commit to where they want to be, financially and otherwise. And then they have to draw in all the stakeholders. So basically the entire organization is moving in lockstep from the leader on down, where the decisions are made financially, staff-wise, everything that needs to be done to get on board, technology-wise to get on board, and a commitment to get there, because it's not easy. There are going to be challenges, right? Challenges around IT are not the bigger ones. The bigger ones are really the organizational change management changes and getting people to get on board.
It sounds really like what you're saying is that the challenges are less around the technology side. It's like we have our hands around that. This is more of a cultural challenge, right?
So it's both, you're right, but yes, I mean the cultural challenge is the larger one, but when you think about the federal government, the tough decisions they have to make is move from large-scale legacy systems, right, to the digital model, and it does require a change in the way that they do business. It does require a financial commitment, and right now they find themselves spending the majority of their financial appropriations keeping the lights on, right? So keeping the same old legacy systems up and running, and somehow there has to be a shift. They have to, and that's where the leadership piece comes in. The top of the organization, somebody has to decide, we're not going to keep doing that. We're going to start shifting the dollars in the other direction.
In the federal government, on that shift, what are some of the lessons learned that you can share and talk about?
So lessons learned on the federal side. So I think for us, what Capgemini has learned in the global public sector around these types of engagements, and I think I talked about leadership and commitment. I think we've gotten that's clear. I think the other piece is really looking at the process flow. So one of the things that I'll throw out as an interesting sort of idea is that the IRS, for example, I'm going to use a health example, but the IRS, for example, does not audit every single taxpayer, correct? But when you start talking about Medicare claims, I'm going to use what's going to sound like a simplistic example just to get the point across, but Medicare claims, there's a 5-step process. For example, if a claimant wants to acquire and get financial claim reimbursed for a wheelchair. And let's talk electronic wheelchairs just so we can keep it on the electronic plane, right? In order to do that, there's a 5-step process. Typically, the bit of data analytics that we've been able to see, and CMS has been on this, they know, it looks like, so nobody makes it through the first 2 channels. We get to the 3rd channel, the 3rd phase before claims really get approved. So the theory that I'd like to put forward is what if we looked at data analytics and automation, we take and we look at the process flow from the very beginning at the front end and how we can do things better. And for example, here's a crazy idea. What if we approved every single wheelchair claim that came through? What if we approved every single one and line those costs up with what it costs to keep 5 phases of employees and all the IT infrastructure and the facilities and everything else to decide whether or not somebody should get a wheelchair. And then you'd use the patterns and the data and analytics to determine what are the triggers for the really big problems. What kinds of things show up in a pattern to identify the people who are really taking advantage of the system, and then you target those.
Denise, what are the security concerns using outdated legacy applications?
So that's a great point. The security, we know that we've learned so much in the last few years around security, whether we're talking cybersecurity or just individual security. And so I think that the risk there really is that those systems are not up to par with what we know the incoming threats are. So we know a lot more about the vulnerability threats and how people get into systems now than we did before. And those systems aren't ready to handle those things. Whereas the case management systems that are out in the marketplace now, as well as the security protocols that we would build around deploying a system like that from the very beginning, they hit the mark. They're as up to speed as they can be. We know that's a growing space, but they're as up to speed as they can be.
We have about a minute left. What can you tell me about the mobility piece, which we touched on quickly earlier, but how that relates into everything that we're talking about, particularly around millennials?
Right. So the mobility piece it's imperative. We have to achieve that, and so that's something we build in as well. Right. So when we're thinking about, when we're evaluating a system for a particular client, I talked in the beginning about how we look at the stakeholders and the way of doing business. So it's not only the way the staff are doing business, but how are citizens accessing? What do they want to be able to do? And then you build those applications into the overall deployment of the model, right? So instead of just doing, you don't separate IT, security, and mobility and have different ways of attacking them. It's a holistic view around how you're going to make that move into the digital transformation, into changing the way you do business to a digital model.
Denise, where can the audience go to learn more about some of these topics that we discussed today?
Sure. So capgemini-gs.com. There's plenty of information out there, and they'll find my contact information there as well.
I'd like to thank my guest, Denise Tauriello, a principal with Capgemini Government Solutions. For Federal News Radio, I'm your host, Jason Fornicola.